Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for waiting and joining us from all over the world for this online program tonight with artist Brendan Fernandez, who is joining us from Chicago as part of Richmond Art Gallery's Pride Week 2020 celebrations. My name is Henry Heng Liu. I'm your host tonight. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional ancestral territory of the Hung'ai Minam speaking peoples. This is the language spoken by Musqueam and many nations in the Fraser River Delta. We acknowledge and recognize that the indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from the homelands and territories upon which an institution was built and currently occupies and operates in. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize the city and country's longer history predating Confederation, one where indigenous peoples have lived since time immemorial. We're grateful for the opportunity to create, live, and learn and work in this land. I would like to invite my colleague, Sean Dacey, Director of Richmond Art Gallery, to introduce Brendan.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy Vancouver Richmond Pride. And thank you for joining us tonight. First off, I'd like to thank Henry, our host, for supporting us with tonight's event. As you all know, Pride is being celebrated a little differently this year, perhaps more a time of introspection and small gatherings. This talk tonight came together through a discussion with Todd Evanger from the Richmond Arts Center regarding a series of online programs that we're hosting this week at the City of Richmond. In discussion with Todd, we really felt that at this moment, it was important to frame the discussion of Pride around its original intent as a protest and as an event of visible community celebration and activism. There is an ongoing urgency, not only in Richmond, but around the world, that we combat discrimination, especially for LGBTQ2S and BIPOC communities, and to evolve safe spaces for sharing, for listening, for learning, and for being together. And we really hope that these online discussions are something like that, or are that. So I'm very excited to start this conversation today. With all that, suffice to say, when thinking about who to invite, the first person who came to my mind was Brendan. Brendan is a close friend and longtime collaborator, and someone I've learned so much from, and someone whose practice I really cherish, and I'm excited with every new project that he develops. So I'm so happy he can be here this evening with us. So Fernandez's artistic practice addresses issues of race, queer culture, migration, protest, and other forms of collective movement. Always looking to create new spaces and new forms of agency, Brendan's projects take on hybrid forms, part ballet, part queer dance hall, part political protest, but always rooted in collaboration and fostering solidarity. Brendan is a graduate of the Whitney Independent Study Program and a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Rauschenberg Fellowship and Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. His projects have been shown at the Whitney Biennial, the Guggenheim Museum, MoMA New York, the Getty Museum, the National Gallery of Canada, and many other great institutions. He is currently artist in residence and faculty at Northwestern University, and he's represented by Monique Meloche Gallery in Chicago. And I do want to give a special thanks to Ashley from Monique's Gallery for her help in putting together this talk. The other exciting news is that Brendan is currently developing an exhibition that will be happening at Richmond Art Gallery this time next year in 2021. And in certain ways, this talk tonight is a introduction to our community of Brendan's practice, and also a bit of a in anticipation beginning point. The exhibition Inaction is in partnership with the Zilkha Gallery at Wesleyan University. Brendan mounted the exhibition there last year, and we are so excited to bring the Inaction project to Richmond, where Brendan will be working with local dancers and putting together an amazing installation. So time to move forward. So Brendan will offer us a presentation of his works. Then him and I will have a bit of a conversation. There is a Q&A prompt to ask some questions, and we'll try to get through a few of those as well. So please submit your questions in the window, I think at the bottom of your screen. And I do want to promote one other thing. As I mentioned earlier, with the City of Richmond and with the Richmond Art Center, this is actually part one of our Pride Week programming. So please join us for part two, which is entitled Intersections, Pride and Visual Culture Online Workshop. And that will be happening this Saturday, August 1st at 11 a.m. So Brendan, who's with us today, will be collaborating with the Branscombe House Artist in Residence, Lou Shepard, for an online workshop that explores histories of pride, semiotics, language, art, and identity. So you can register for free. You just contact artcenter@richmond.ca to sign up for that. I think it will be a nice partner discussion and more hands-on chat for you on Saturday. So hopefully you can join for that. So now I guess I will pass it on to our esteemed guest, Brendan Fernandez. Welcome, Brendan.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much. That was a very kind and generous introduction, and I'm really glad to be here. Hello, everybody. Coming in from Chicago, Illinois, where I'm based right now, and yeah, super grateful to be part of this. And again, like most, things that we do, it takes many people. So again, thank you to Sean for being a support continuously, to Henry, to Todd, to Lou for making for supporting, but also for making things happen on Saturday with the workshop. I'm really excited about that, and I hope you guys will join. And yeah, thanks to my gallery, Monique Meloche Gallery, and Ashley, the director, for putting, helping coordinate things, and to the Zilkha Gallery, Rosemary and Ben for supporting this exhibition and bringing it to Richmond, which I can't wait to make this happen. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a couple of my projects, and I'm going to then open it up to questions and sort of just talk about my work as a maker, which primarily deals between the intersections of dance and visual arts. And I am at a place right now where, during COVID, I've been thinking a lot about what does that mean? Because part of my work is about social gatherings. It's about creating solidarity. It's about using dance as a material to be political. Dance as a thing that is seen as being ephemeral, as being beautiful, romanticized, but also something that can bring people together. And right now, this is a challenge for me, and I've been thinking a lot about this through my practice. A lot of my work also thinks about queer spaces. What is a queer space? I've been questioning the dance floor as a space of gathering, as a space of social solidarity as well. But for me, as a queer POC artist, I think a lot about the club. What does that space mean for us? What does that mean now for us? But also thinking about virtual space. What is safe space? Can we have these spaces? What is this utopic ideal? And something that we're striving for still. Like currently, we are going through so many social political spaces within the COVID pandemic. And, we're thinking about, the deaths of so many African-American people are in this country that I'm in right now, but around the world, people identify as Black, but also a lot of trans lives. And so I've been part of this, and I've been thinking a lot through it as something that is my lived experience, but also as something that I need to think through my projects, because I always think socially and politically and things that affect me. And so I've been really thinking about the street as a space for gatherings as we protest. So I might just kind of open up the projects and talk through them. And then Sean and I will have a Q&A, and then we'll open it up to you guys. So yes. So Henry, if you want to open up the presentation. So yes, as I mentioned, a lot of my work deals with dance and working with dancers. So collaboratively, I feel that we all work together. My space is an open space. It's a space for generosity, for kindness, for expression of people doing things together. This piece was called A Steady Pulse. And it was part of a residency, a 3-month residency in Manhattan, in Soho, a storefront given to me by a foundation called Recess, where I was thinking about, how do we make a space? How does a space be transformative? And as a queer person, I feel that queerness is always in transition, is always something that's changing. So for this piece, I worked with 3 dancers, and people could come to the space whenever they wanted to, and the performance gradually grew. It became something as we were making. So at certain dates, you'd come into the space, and when we were still trying to learn our vocabulary of what the dance was, you'd watch that process. So there was no real beginning or end or final performance. It was just like an ongoing piece. And Steady Pulse, as you'll see, was based on a piece that I made that was an ode to the Orlando Pulse Massacre. And so having 3 months to work through this idea, I was really thinking about, the space where these dance floors become, or these platforms, in different skin color tones, become an architecture. How do dancers deal with architecture? How do we allow our bodies to be prescribed to the architecture? So here, the dancers, the dance floor becomes a space of agency. The dancers, whenever I work with my dancers, we always ask each other, what is the floor made out of? How is this floor, this flat kind of invisible architecture, how does that penetrate our bodies? After we move on it, the hard labor comes into our bodies and we hold it in there. So I started to make these kind of like flesh tone platforms with these sort of spongy bottoms that sort of very simple gesture, but it created resistance. It allowed the dancers to move on the floor. It allowed them to be able to dance longer, or to play longer, or to create longer. And so I kind of think of some of my work as these kind of playgrounds, a space for the dancers to create something. But every day when they came into the space, so we did it every day for 3 months, they would change the space. They would move the floors. And sometimes it became a space for, we had a talk. And so we had all the floors kind of creating more like a theater space in the round. Or when we were giving pile them on top, it becomes a podium, a pedestal for someone to stand on and speak up to. And so it became this transformative space. And one of the gestures of the choreography that I started to give them was that they had to speak to each other in Morse code and call out to each other. And they would call out, or they would tap out, the beat goes on. And so for me, they would also start each day's performance with the song, The Beat Goes On by the Whispers, which for me it's this kind of disco celebration song, but the beat means so many things. This is an ode to Pulse Orlando. So the beat, the heartbeat, the pulse, needs to continue. There's this notion that they have to, the beat is the violence, it continues. And so we were making this kind of space, and people would come and watch. And, it became this ongoing transformative space. And when a dancer wasn't there, the uniform that they wore was used as something that they would fold or cradle or gesture with. And so it became a growing process. And eventually they kind of took it to other spaces, they went outside and performed. This is another piece called I'm Down. And I'm Down was commissioned by the 18th Street Art Center in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, is a very city that uses a lot of cars. But now the city has created a train line that it becomes a main artery between Santa Monica into the downtown of Los Angeles. And so it became this question of like, let's see how gentrification, how do changings of spaces by bringing a train line affect the community. So I worked on, and a lot of my work is process-based. So I'm always doing research for months before I go into the space. And so I worked with the local community. And there was also a part of this piece where we had like an archive of interviews and stories of the local community and the things that they did. And then I created this dance that was an ongoing performance piece that was sort of mimicking protest. We would, and you never knew where we were gonna be. So my work doesn't necessarily show up on stage. It doesn't necessarily have a timing. So the way you found us was you would sign up to a texting system. And if you texted, "I'm down," you would get poetic kind of gestures from my score. So different things like, let's gather together. Let's find a space for us. And then the day before we were going somewhere, you'd get a text that said, "Now meet us to make these gestures in this space." So you would come and find us. And people would follow when they would see us on the street. People would ask us, "Well, what are you doing?" And our t-shirts said, "We are moving change." And so people were like, "What is moving change? What does this mean?" And so I also used the language of language of dance, movement, for example, as a way to kind of think about things politically, like what is movements? And so people would come and follow us and ask us questions, and we would talk to them. It isn't like the kind of performance where we like ignore. It became a conversation, but people would also follow us and then come and find us via the text messaging system. So I'm Down was one of the first pieces where I started to think about protest as a form of like moving through a space. We were on the train. We were in different parts of the city. And then it always culminated and ended the performances at this mural, which the train goes by and it says, "Our days begin and end as stories." And so I really think, and it says it in the 4 languages of the neighborhood. So, and I was really thinking about this idea, and this piece resonates for me now too, because I think about, how, days end, and we kind of think about our histories. So how do we reflect on, the new spaces? So I think one thing that I would like to talk a lot about is that as I'm thinking socially and politically right now, I'm also thinking about what are the new ways that we can make and support and think about new ideas, new social imaginaries. And so partially that's what some of the newer work is really pushing towards, but my work has always thought about that idea of the Marxist imaginary. We can move to the next slide. So this is steady. This is Free Fall. And Free Fall was the piece that kind of was, and interestingly enough, like I was working in Victoria with a dancer from Ballet BC, Rachel Myers, who's a collaborator and has done a couple of projects with me and Sean. But I was just thinking a lot about the idea of the dance floor again, the dance floor as a space for a dancer that for me, and I guess I should have prefaced, like my background is that of a ballet dancer. I trained for a number of years. I left dance due to injury, but when we're on stage, you can never fall. Falling is not allowed. Like, you have to be like strong in ballet, but you also have to make it look effortless. But if you fall, it's always like a romanticized, glorified fall. But if you just fall, it's seen as like imperfection. So I was thinking just about the idea of falling. What does falling mean? And we can just like hold here for a second, Henry. I was thinking a lot about choreographing a fall. How do I make a ballet dancer fall and then think about them, not hurting their body? Because again, we're talking about the dance floor. The dance floor is that space of impact. Now you're falling on it. And so I started to think about that, and I started to question just the notion of a sprung floor, the idea of resistance as something that is physical, but also like social and political. And at this time, when I was trying to make these rehearsals or these choreographies of how to fall, the Pulse Orlando massacre happened, and that was a really hard thing for me to deal with. To think about, a club, a space where, you know, queer, POC, Latinx people gather at was infiltrated, and people's freedoms and sanctuaries were you know, were obstructed. And so I started thinking about the club. And a lot of my time before when I lived in New York, the club, and still today, the club is a really important space for me as a queer. And so I started to think about, you know, what does it mean when 49 people didn't leave the club? And so I made this piece called Free Fall, where we were working with, you know, a number of dancers, and this is the Getty Center in Los Angeles, where I work with a DJ, and this is the Free Friday, and people come to see the museum, but it's a free night, and they were gathering in the courtyard, and we created a dance party, you know, a dance party, and all my dancers are dancing on platforms, very open, kind of like, you know, raw platform. On the stage is a DJ who's creating a sound, and for this specific piece, it was a friend of mine, How to Dress Well, and we created a sound score. But then every few minutes, he or I together would play a sound cue that kind of had this kind of like pulse of a heartbeat, but also the sound of a gunshot, and then it went to like silence, and the music cut off, and all the dancers fall to the ground. And so in one of the slides, you saw the dancers all laying on this platform. And the choreography of them hitting that floor was what I taught them. And then slowly the music comes back up, and they start to gather their bodies, and they're holding their bodies, and they're dusting their bodies, and then they start to dance again. And so we do this 49 times. So it's a grueling performance and we have a time, so like a count up. Yeah, a count up. And so you kind of can tell and feel the sense of what's going to happen. And then eventually, you know, people were the audience for me was very, you know, it always changes. This piece is always emotional for me. But the audience, the first fall starts to kind of be like, what happened? You know, like, what did the DJ do? Did the power go out? And there's sometimes, like, when all the dancers fall, for this piece, this one time people started to laugh because they felt uncomfortable. But as we started to get, the night started to get darker, and people started to see the count up, people started to dance with us, and then people started to also fall with us. And, you know, towards the end of this night, when we're getting up to 49, to give acknowledgement, to support to each of these people that fell, you know, and gave their lives at the club in this awful moment and this massacre, you know, people start to fall together. And there was 5,000 people at the end of the night. And at one point, like, everything was like 47, everyone fell to the ground. And it was this dead silence. And there's a space of like emergency, urgency, but also agency. And then we all stand up. So standing up is a political gesture that I use a lot in my choreography. The idea to stand up, you know, we can fall, but we also have to stand up to move forward. And so at the end of this piece, we move to the next slide, you know, we all just, you know, it was like this like moment of celebration. Everyone just, you know, got off the platforms, the dancers finally got off the platforms, and they're hugging everyone, and we're just inviting people to dance. And then the piece continues on as a dance party. We just dance without the falls, and it's like another hour or two. But for me, again, this is a gathering. This is a moment to bring people together. This is a space of inclusivity. It's a space where, you know, we create, you know, and I hope, you know, a place for people to feel free and just move their bodies. And it became a really important kind of idea that I've been pushing through in other works as well, the idea of the dance party. We can move to the next one. So this is actually a good segue. And a lot of my work is also graphic based. So I always work like graphically to create like a poster, excuse me, for the performance, or to think about, you know, some kind of piece. So this is for Steady Pulse. Sorry, I'm getting confused today. This is for Unflashing Lights that happened no, this is for Steady Pulse, but we used a similar poster idea for Unflashing Lights. So here's Unflashing Lights. I know I was like, I'm going crazy. So Unflashing Lights was a piece was a commission for Nuit Blanche in 2018. And I was really thinking a lot again about, Toronto, where I am from. I've lived outside of Toronto for many years, but it's still my home, one of my homes. My family is still there, and I have great connections to the city. Right now, one of the hardest things for me is not being able to come to Canada and not seeing my family and seeing my friends like all over, but specifically Toronto right now is a hard space for me that I don't have access to the same way I used to. Like, I would just go whenever I wanted. Now I have to really think about the idea of like traveling there. But in 2018, Tyrone Bastian, who's from Vancouver, but now based in Toronto, commissioned me for his part of Nuit Blanche. And I said to him, like, I've done it a number of times, but I really, if I'm going to do this with you, I want to do this project. And I was thinking a lot about the queer POC community in Toronto and the issues that, we've been having with the police and, the idea of, who is protecting my body? Who's looking after my body? Who is, creating visibility for me, and who is also creating, like invisibility for me. So I started thinking about this specific idea, and I think in 2017, the Toronto Pride asked the police not to march. So there was a tension between queers in Toronto, specifically queers, POCs, but also just the kind of idea with the police system. And right now, we've been thinking a lot about police brutality, police violence, abolishing the police system, restructuring the police system. So this piece was talking about that in 2018. And what I did was I worked with a movie set. And we hired, I think it was 24 cars that were all white. I didn't want them to have any geographic location, but they all had, they were all fixed with sirens on top of the roof of the car. And in the center, we created a little DJ set. And I worked with 6 POC queer DJs from Toronto, and we created a dance party. It was called Unflashing Lights, where we're dancing to the beats, the sounds, the rhythms, creating a gathering again, creating solidarity, but also, dancing to the lights of police cars. So is this a state of emergency? Is this a state of celebration? So there's that tension. And for me, like also going to the club, sometimes there's this euphoric idea that there's such freedom in this space, but then there's also this sometimes an existential dread or fear. And that's going back to this idea of Pulse Orlando. Like after Pulse Orlando, I had a hard time going back to the club. I just felt like what could happen here, or gatherings were kind of scary for me. And the police in Toronto knew about this. They were aware of it. They obviously didn't participate, but or they did in the sense that they circled around the party, and I was kind of like surveilling, but also for me like adding to the animation of the party with the police cars, and it became this huge gathering. We had 10,000 people, and it was in front of City Hall in Toronto. So like a direct kind of statement, about like what are we doing to protect people? What are we doing to make people feel visible? And I'm going to just jump back to, I don't have to see the slide, but in Steady Pulse, when my dancers were tapping out, in Morse code, the beat goes on. It was a way to play a call and response game for them to kind of find each other, like they're within the space. And eventually, when we had a break, and they're like, we're trying to call each other, but we can't hear each other. And I said, that's fine. That becomes part of the piece, because sometimes we're not heard. Sometimes we're not seen. And so, if we think about Pulse Orlando or just other kind of crises, sometimes we're not heard. And so like right now, even on the streets of Chicago, and in Toronto and in Vancouver and in Richmond, we're protesting. We're trying to be heard. We're trying to be seen in this idea of a social political gathering that we call protest. But for me, this is also another form of protest. And I guess I should define that protest can take on many forms. And so even right now in my social media, I keep posting just to keep the energy going, but I'm also finding other ways to do it through, donating money, through going onto the streets, masked and protesting and calling out. So the idea of protest can have many iterations, but I also find it through a structure of dance and gathering. If we move to the next piece, how are we doing? So this is a piece that I did for the Whitney Biennial, and it's more of a piece that thinks about queer spaces as alternative culture, as a space of, again, inclusivity, but counterculture. As a ballet dancer, you know, ballet is such a specific culture, but we also are such masochists. And I started thinking a lot about my space here in Chicago. You know, Chicago has a very important leather BDSM community, and there's a leather museum here. And I was doing a lot of research, and one of the main founders of the Leather Archive here in Chicago, the Leather Archive and Museum, was a former ballet dancer. So I started to think a lot about the ideas of fetish, the ideas of masochisms. And when I was a young dancer, my feet were always the things that the dance world, the ballet world criticized. My feet didn't have arches. So I used to use these wooden devices to bind my feet to give me this arch. And an arch is not meant to be something that supports you or makes you stronger. It's an aesthetic. It's like, you know, an ideal of beauty. And so I started thinking about the foot stretchers, and I did a piece about the foot stretchers. I didn't include in this presentation, but it's called Standing Leg, that I created with Sean when he was at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver. So Standing Leg was this piece, my first time using my body ever after injury as a dancer. And I remember Sean, like, I was nervous, and I was telling him how I told you I'm gonna do this piece, but I don't wanna dance. And but we did it, and it's a piece that gave me some freedoms to emotionally, mentally, and physically to move forward. And partially this piece came out of that. This is the master and form, thinking about the ballet technique. Ballet has one way to do it, you know, and one type of body. And my body was also deemed not perfect. I also, as a, you know, ballet comes from a very Western hegemony where bodies of color don't necessarily exist. So the history is still needing to be changed. And so in my work, I try to counter those hegemonies, those Western pivots, to give a new idea of what ballet can be. So I create these playgrounds. I work with architectural firm Norman and Kelly, and we create these what I call like playgrounds for the dancers to move in. And there's a sequence, a very choreographed sequence, because when I work with ballet dancers, everything has to be timed, everything has to be, it's very specific. Where I work with contemporary dancers, we can have more space to improvise. But when I tell them to improvise, they have a hard time. So the only time that they can improvise is in this device called the cage, but they have to stretch. So they still create their own structure to move forward in. But if we move forward, maybe one more time. You can see here, this is Violetta, and she's in this wooden device. So I started creating full body devices to put ballet dancers in the perfect position. And everywhere, anywhere a body part touches, there's leather on them so that the body can have skin to skin intimacy. And I call that, and for me, these are like, you know, full body devices from my foot stretcher. Like, this is for the full body, where the foot stretcher just fits my foot on. So part of the score is that they have to stand and rest and move in these devices for up to 30 minutes. The performance is 5 hours long, and they kind of rotate, and they kind of find spaces of when they can rest. And, you know, for a ballerina, you know, wearing point shoes is very challenging. So there's moments where they'll take their point shoes off, and they do this thing where, like, they'll, you know, like, beat their muscles with their shoes to kind of relax them, and then they go into this cage device. So the master and form looks at the questions of beauty, the ideas of mastery, the idea of form, but also the kind of questions of fetish, the kind of ideas of what is deemed beautiful, what is deemed, you know, being not beautiful. And in ballet, that's definitely a structure that is perpetuated. So I'm challenging the structure of ballet. And it is beautiful, and they are technical bodies that are being trained and are doing such, you know, important work. So I want to give them that, but I also want to diversify and challenge. You know, this is a ballet. Master and Form is a ballet, but it's not seen on a stage. It's not following a narrative. It's not telling a specific kind of story. It's doing it in a different way. And so for me, again, this is a new form, a new way to recharge and reinvent an already existing tradition. And I'll be honest right now, I'm looking right now straight you know, Amy's face, they're exhausted. I make my dancers do very intense things. And in part of that, I give them agency to leave when they want to take off their shoes if they want to. But again, the inherentness of a dancer is that you cannot stop. You can't fall. You have to keep going. And so there's that kind of like, again, that masochism that I dealt with. And I think as an art maker, that, you know, dedication, that rigor of how I work continues with me now, but it comes from the dance world. We can move to the next one. So this is another piece I did at the Guggenheim last year. Last year was a busy year. I had the Whitney Biennial, and then I had this project at Guggenheim, which was part of a big gala event for their Young Collectors Council. It's one of their biggest kind of events the Guggenheim does performance at. And this is still this was kind of like a teaser. I'm still working on a piece, finishing the ideas again of masochism. But I've been thinking a lot about rope bondage and restraint, and how does one find freedom within restraint? And so if my arms are tied together, how do I then create movements, or how do I move, or how do I find a new way to move? So I've been working with shibari, which is a Japanese form of rope bondage. It's an art form that has a history and a tradition in Japan, but it's also part of BDSM culture. And so I started working with rope riggers to teach me, so a mentorship space, but then we together tie the dancers and see how they kind of create new choreographies, new movements. So this was more like a teaser for a project that I'm going to be working on. And it's going to be like working with a number of dancers. It's going to happen in San Francisco, hopefully for 2022, and working with the notions of tying, but how do we find freedom within restraint? So again, a political question, like within restraint of a pandemic, restraint within a place where people don't have civil rights. How do we kind of find new movements? So I work with the dancers, and they create such different ways of moving that are, you know, quote unquote, a new choreography for me, but also a challenge to, again, the Western hegemony of a ballet culture. And so this piece is called Ballet King. So the idea of it being, you know, an othered form of a traditional dance form. We can go to the next one. And again, a gathering. We dance, people watch, but then it disseminates into a dance party. And everyone who comes then moves together. And so again, another form of making a dance gathering, a social space, but also a space to politically think, like, why am I watching this? Why am I part of this as well? Is a self-reflective question to definitely ask in all of my work. And my audience is always participating, whether they know it or not. So we're coming to the end of my proposal, my presentation, sorry. And this is a piece that I just finished last year. I was awarded a New Chapters grant by the Canada Council, and I was thinking a lot about the idea of pulse again. You know, it's something that resonates with me, and it still is always, you know, there's many political things that are happening, but I still think about that event. And I wanted to make a film. I wanted to make a full, like a real film, thinking about choreography, thinking about fallen bodies, thinking about Hollywood film, specifically Busby Berkeley, and those Hollywood black and white films where dancers fell to the ground, almost glamorized, and then their fans would open and they would move, and it felt like it was like this glamorized fall. And so Study Pulse is a piece that will actually be part of Inaction at the RAG. It's part of the exhibition, and I'm really proud of it, but it talks about the space, again, of the dance floor. What is a safe space? Where do we find freedom? How do we support each other? How do we carry each other if we fall? How do we like stand up on our own? And so it's taking on the ideas from Free Fall, the performance, but it's a film, but it's very like, again, lush, beautiful. There's a lot more choreography. Everything's filmed from above. There's moments where the camera is a device that choreographs, because it's actually moving through the space. It's actually moving through the dancers. I think a lot about camera choreography. How do we dance with the camera? And so it's very specific. It's very, you know, lush and beautiful. But at this moment, it has this really poignant tension of emergency. The sound gives you that space. But if you go to the next slide, maybe the next one. There's moments where the bodies fall and you have these flashes of lights that play with ideas of emergency, police space. And so again, it questions that notion of violence, but it's almost like a beautiful violence that makes you feel uncomfortable. It makes you want to, you know, question the space. So this will be part of the RAG show. And then I'm just going to entry into Inaction, which is another playground, a playground for dancers, which is going to be the second part of my show at the RAG. And I'm going to be working with a different set of dancers when I come to Vancouver, to Vancouver and then to Richmond. But I'm really excited about working with Vancouver, Richmond dancers, BC dancers. I've done projects with Sean before, but I've done other projects in the province, and I just love the rich, vital dance community. So I'm excited to come back and work with them. But this playground is kind of like has different, it's kind of playing on a children's playground. There's different devices. I always call my devices, which are sculptures when the dancers aren't there, that transform into props that support, but also could be burdens for the dancers after. So there's also that kind of strange, undefined, non-defined, you know, space or identity to my sculptures / props / objects. But I always call them devices. So the kind of thematic for this piece, this is a great slide, let's stay here for a second, is this is square. The pink piece is called square, and the center piece is called circle, and then the big kind of like black kind of leather piece is called triangle. And these always become spaces for playing games. I've been using a lot of like choreographies for call and response, follow the leader, hide and seek. So strategy games that children play, but using them to make kind of like gestures for dance. And in those sort of wooden kind of like sculptures, I don't know what to call them, are called the tumblers. So there's moments where the dancers will work in tandem of two dancers at one time, tumbling them to kind of create dance patterns. And then they will then retreat from them and then come and play a game in either square, circle, or triangle. And so we'll be creating this choreography at the RAG, at the Richmond Art Gallery, next year. And I'm super excited to kind of see how it changes, how it becomes something different and new, but also still holding on to the kind of vocabulary that I've created for this piece. I mean, I worked with Rad Harouni, who's a Montreal-based, Paris-based fashion designer, and we kind of created these costumes. And but I also just love the way that, again, this becomes a gathering. And again, social programming with this show, we created a dance party as well. And this was at Wesleyan University, and it was like another amazing thing where we could have another gathering for these students to come to make, to gather, to be social, to be critical. So again, you know, the idea of criticality, you know, I want the dance to be political, to be self-reflexive, but to be critical. I'll probably end there, and then I know Sean has some amazing questions for me, and then I can talk to everyone else. Thank you.
I think, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you very much, Brendan.
You're welcome.
Do you want me to just kind of play the slides till the end?
Sure.
Yeah, as you guys talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Yeah, first, I have a few questions, but I want to remind people if they have a question, they can enter their question into the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get to it. Yeah, having witnessed your growth as an artist and this kind of vein into dance over the past many years, I just love the level of production and collaboration, and I wonder about all these subjectivities within your pieces, dancers, designers, choreographers, and I know that with the Wesleyan project you were working with student dancers, and for the Whitney, these were professional dance work. So you're working with at times many different skill levels, and many different sort of subject positions that I think bring so much to these works, and I'm so excited about what's going to happen in Richmond. But I wonder what attracts you to this process of collaboration with the dancers and the choreographies, and sort of what is your process in collaborating and kind of working with different skill levels and sort of subject positions, and when working with people from very different situations. How do you bring all those kind of elements together?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because collaboration is the foundation of my practice. It's never on my own. It's always with different communities, different entities, and I think one of the words you use, which is really important, is the idea of production. So like it takes a lot of people to make something happen. But for me, collaboration is about exchange. It's about give and take. It's about a generous space. And I think for me, when I talk about solidarity or finding spaces of gathering, when it's also about finding solidarity and exchanging and giving back and forth, where it's not about an I or a me. It's about a we. And so I really think a lot about that. And like I'm always ever so grateful to my dancers, because they give so much. Like they're giving me their bodies, they're giving me their actual physical being to be part of the work. And so I really think a lot about that. But collaboration for me, growing up in the dance world, you always collaborate. You're always like, a part of a group. You're always part of an entity that is supporting and making together. And so even like with Steady Pulse, for example, or a lot of my pieces, it's a conversation with me and my dancers. It's a conversation with me and an architect's firm, such as Norman and Kelly. Or it would be, it's a conversation between me and you, like even like, I'm thinking about, our show, and we're already having so many conversations about what it's going to be, how it's going to formulate, how are we going to bring in the dancers, who will the dancers be? So it's a very porous space of communication, and I think that's just a very important structure that we just need to follow in the general sense of humanity. Like to like be communicative, to be transparent, to be giving, to be willing to take on challenge and change, but to be able to make things together is such an important thing. I think a lot about it through like even like Black Mountain College and the exchanges between like Robert Rauschenberg or Merce Cunningham, which also were kind of strangely queer, because it wasn't about, and queer not being a moniker of sexual orientation or gendered space. One about making something that is self-identifying, open socially to become something that can also transform to something else. So I think I answered your question. I think I went on a tangent, but I definitely think collaboration is an exchange. It's part of the work that I'm just also used to, because I grew up in a dance world. So I know how to make things. And again, it's not saying it's perfect, but it's a formula, it's a structure that I try to use to think about self-inclusivity, social solidarity.
And looking closer at your pieces and the dancers you pick, are you purposely looking for a mixed group of bodies in the sense of different body shapes, different genders, different ethnicities? What is your process around that, or do you have thoughts around that? Because I think it's a really interesting aspect as well, because you are dealing with a certain kind of dancer body, but then in other works you're not.
Yeah, and I definitely think, like, I've got this where people say, like, oh, your dancers are so quote unquote beautiful. And my response is, like, I don't cast them based on their bodies. I cast them based on their abilities, and dancers are athletes. So when a dancer is training for 16 hours a day, their body will become something. If that's by society deemed beautiful, that is part of it, but I'm also challenging that. In some of my works, I'll just put out a call where I don't say, I'm looking for, I'll just say I'm looking for 16 dancers who are strong and otherwise authoritative. And if you identify within that statement and you want to be part of it, you can be part of the dance. And like, I did that for a piece at Sculpture Center in New York. And, I had a 75-year-old lady who said, like, I'm strong and otherwise authoritative. And I'm like, great, you're in the piece. I had this bodybuilder from New Jersey who was like, I'm strong and otherwise authoritative. So I really do think about the language, because again, I also think about the way that my body was othered or marginalized within that system. But I'm very open to bringing in all types of people, all types of bodies, because that's also something that we need to change. But I also do need to preface that, when dancers are training and I'm working with professionals, with companies, they have a standard because they're training so hard, so they're going to be athletes. And I think that's an important thing to question and to respect and to value our labor. That when performing is laborious, we make it look effortless, but we're definitely in a training space, and our bodies are going to transform and be something.
I have more questions, but there's a really great question in the Q&A that I think is like a good moment to bring it up. Thank you, Nathan, for the question. So Nathan asks, in your work you address really serious topics, yet you often use words like party, playground, games to describe your work. Why and how do you gravitate towards these jovial ideas when discussing protest, inequality, racism, tragedy? Yeah.
Thanks, Nathan. I definitely, I still think that, even the word dance can be seen as being, like jovial, but I still think that these spaces are important spaces to be self-critical about. A party can also be a space that doesn't necessarily have to be jovial. I also talk to a lot of queers where I say the club, for example, and they're like, I don't like the club. It's not that safe space that, you might think it is, or someone else might think it is. So again, it's redefining the spaces, but also using those as platforms or places that we're known to gather in. So I'm trying to really think about, like when I'm at the club, I'm not invisible because, someone's not going to see me. Or, someone said to me, like, I don't like going to the bar in this route because it's not the right place for me to, I just don't feel like comfortable there. So it's also still using those spaces and challenging the structure, like they're not always jovial. They're not, we definitely know that clubs, and I know Nathan's in Chicago, that, even spaces like Boys Town, which is our gay village, is a very racialized, segregated space. Doesn't include everybody, but people still go there to celebrate Pride and to be seen. So I really question the spaces that are, and that's why I say it's not necessarily a safe space. We're still trying to figure out what a safe space is. I would also maybe use the word brave space, because there's this idea that we kind of go in and challenge those spaces. I think we're still in a process. So again, queer doesn't necessarily mean positive as well. Like, a queer space can be one that doesn't always include all queers or all people in that space. So I use those spaces as as transformative spaces.
So yeah, I mean, I think this is a good lead into one of my main questions. Is I recall when the Orlando shootings at Pulse happened, and after that there was a real shift in what you were making and what you were making about, and has really led you down this vein in a certain way, and in a very fruitful vein of inquiry. So, and I think you talk a little bit about being in the club and these sorts of queer spaces, whether people feel safe or not in them, but these are the kind of spaces where queer people have congregated, whether it's a lesbian bar or a bathhouse or an S&M club. And I think spatially your work really kind of connects to that, even to the ideas of the gym or the ballet class, and think about queer bodies in those spaces. So why did you feel that urgency with the Pulse shooting? And I think another interesting point is it was a Latinx predominant sort of nightclub, which is an interesting aspect too.
Yeah, I think for me, as I said, my specificity to the club in New York, the Vogue Ball scene, the gay bar, the queer bar, those places became something that allowed me a sense of feeling freedom, even though I'm still grappling with that definition, but it allowed me a space to go to and be a part of. And so I think, and I'm not saying, I think I felt that, the club was a space for people to go to feel like they can meet people like themselves. And so when it became infiltrated and challenged through Pulse Orlando, it made me kind of like stop and really feel a moment of like, oh, we still have work to do. Our freedoms, our sanctuaries, our rights, our values are still things we're needing to do. We're still fighting for them, but at a certain time, I think people were like, and even with the idea of Pride Month, everyone's like, it's Pride Month, Pride is not a month, we know that Martha P. Johnson like threw a brick at the Stonewall and started a riot. We see that line all the time, like the first Pride was a riot. And then I think about just what's happening now, with Black Lives Matters, and the questions of people still needing their civil rights, and so for me, I really think about that as an impulse to be like, you are still needing to be seen, you're still needing to be invisible. So I think there's a very political important space that I'm looking in your work about how am I invisible? Like, I don't necessarily always want to say, here I am. I want to also just kind of like pass as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about those spaces in your work. And then again, right now, I've been thinking about virtual space. We're all gathering now through a virtual space, and a virus is creating a pandemic in this world. But how does a virtual space allow us to feel safe, or to feel separate, or to feel isolated? So again, the spaces are still in flux, and are being challenged in those same rights. So yeah, but I think the Pulse Orlando massacre threw me off because it made me really think through the idea of where am I and my community socially and politically within our civil rights. And it was like, I get emotional when I think about it, and when we re-perform it. Study Pulse, it always is hard. Like, and I'm gonna, like last year I performed it with a number of amazing dancers at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, and I went there. We were gonna perform it on Sunday. I went on Saturday, and I went and met a bunch of friends and from the museum, and we went to the Pride Parade, and all of a sudden, we were being pushed out of the main area of where the parade was happening, because someone said someone was in the crowds with an open gun, and people just started running. And that was like a moment of like, okay, someone can still hate me for what I am. And so there's something really important about positing Pulse Orlando as something to remember, to acknowledge, but also to move forward and celebrate, as well as kind of challenge how we are going to live and what we need and want at the end of all of this?
Well, you've lit up the Q&A, and I think there's some good questions, so I'll take a few more, and they were some questions that I had as well, so it's better coming from someone else. So another one, I wonder how Brendan thinks about site specificity, ideas of place or geographies as he presents works or as artworks travel. Do works shift in context as the communities or institutions that they are situated in within change?
Yeah, I think, first of all, my work comes from my lived experience, but also I've lived in many places and I travel a lot. So I also feel it's important to work with the community, to try to give the community as much as I can. I remember talking to Sean about this project that we're showing, specifically with the film Freefall, about how I didn't want it to just go to big cities. I wanted it to go to smaller cities, smaller communities. I'm doing a piece in Nebraska because I want to like invest in their local queer community, but then also have a talk, have the show, but also have this kind of like dance party where we can gather, because sometimes smaller communities, regional communities don't have the same support as larger urban cities. And so I think site specificity and working with community is really important for me. And I have to then, what becomes a challenge is that I have to spend enough time there to feel part of it. I can't just come in and be like, hey, here I am. I want to go and spend time. I need to take the time to be part of it. So, but yes, site specificity is something that's important, but also to still go back to the fact that many people are marginalized, and I don't want to say that like my sense of being marginalized is different than your sense of being marginalized. I want to create, I want to break that fracture. I want to break those binaries to say that, like, let's all gather together and talk about it as one. So, and so like my entry allows that to happen within the space that is site specific.
Next question. Thanks, Brendan. I love how your works often end in an invitation for a dance party. I also agree with Stephanie here. You said that your audience is always participating, whether they know it or not. How do you think about making a dance party, or the quote, the club, as a space for criticality within institutional or gallery spaces? How does it have to do, or does it have to do with language, or more about movement or collective consciousness togetherness?
I think dance in the museum, dance in the gallery is always different. I think as soon as you bring live bodies in, or like even performance art into those spaces, it gets challenged. And and many institutions don't support it the way that they should. I think there's still a challenge of what is performance art or dance in a museum. And a lot of the times when I make a piece, it only gets shown once. It happens once and then it's ephemeral and we never see it again. So I think I've been really thinking a lot about how do we challenge museums to do more showing of performance art. And it goes back to Sean's question when he said, we are, it's production. The Whitney Museum really challenged me and gave me a new platform to make performance art. We did that piece 100 times. And each time was 5 hours. So we had like a production space. But that's kind of going off from your question. So I think when I work with museums and galleries, I challenge the etiquettes of what dance can be. Like, it's not what you think dance would look like on a stage, or if you went to see a ballet at a theater. So I'm using the two forms and I'm challenging the etiquettes, the rules that say that this is what it's meant to be, and then make it become something else. So people will always write me and say, what time is your show at the Richmond Art Gallery? And I'm like, it's a 5-hour dance piece. You can come whenever you want. They're like, oh, but how much are the tickets? We still have these inherent traditions of what things should be. And again, within that, my work itself is a querying. It's challenging those notions. It's saying it's one thing. It's also saying it's something else. But that's fine, because that's also how I define myself. And so, making those kinds of challenges, I think, challenged criticality of the space and the institution. And also,
I think Henry has a follow-up question that he's going to ask you.
Where's, oh, I'm like, where's he?
There he is.
Oh,
Henry.
thank you so much, Brendan. I just kind of have a follow-up questions to Stephanie's question, actually, because I was wondering if you can share a little bit about some of the challenges when you're working in museum spaces, I guess, specifically because museums are often seen as this kind of symbols of power and also this kind of representation of colonial enterprises and this kind of collections of objects and then how they were being put on display. So there's an oftentimes this kind of dynamics that can be examined a little bit further. So I guess sort of having this kind of challenges in mind and then how museums are mostly designed also as a site of stillness and also to display these objects, and how does let's say your performative objects sort of playing into that kind of sites that already have that are predominantly white and also creating disadvantageous conditions to BIPOC communities.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, you know, I showed a lot of work very specifically that dealt with my dance. Don't go away, Henry. Like I showed very specific works thinking about pride and queer spaces. I'm not saying that my other work that deals with post-colonial identity is not that, you know. But I've done a lot of work where I work with collections. I work with like looking at my history of being a fifth generation Kenyan Indian that immigrated to Canada and now lives in the US. And I look specifically at mask objects from, you know, from the African continent, specifically West Africa, and how those objects were removed from their place of origin. And partially, I should say, the reason why I use ballet, because ballet also is a Western pivot. Ballet is seen as the civilized form of dance. Ballet it was the dance of the kings. Louis XIV's court bowed to him, and those gestures became what we now known as ballet. So I use that also as a post-colonial, you know, Western hegemony within the work. So ballet is the civilized dance. So in my work, I juxtapose West African masquerade against ballet and kind of create these tensions. So there's a series of work called As One, where ballet dancers, very specifically classically trained ballet dancers, are bowing to objects in the museum, giving their body to it. So almost like giving their body back to the object, but also that acknowledgement, that apology. I also think a lot about, you know, the ways that we decolonize space. And for me, even last year at the Whitney Biennial, you know, there was a lot of questions of like, how do we decolonize the space of the museum? And for me, I think dismantling doesn't mean to destroy and recreate. It's infiltrating from within and challenging from within to make things become different. And so within the Whitney Biennial, like I was one of the artists that stayed in. So there was a moment, I'm sure people know, where people were leaving the biennial due to one of the board members. But I specifically made very open claims that I need to stay in this biennial to make change from within, but also to remember that my work is a living work. If I would draw from a 6-month exhibition, I also like take away livelihoods from 20 dancers. So like we had a cast of 20. And so for me, it's really important to remember that my work is also living, and it's different than just taking, you know, something, an art object down. But for me, decolonizing it's finding change from within. And if I also move myself from an exhibition like the Whitney Biennial, my voice is gone. My work is not there. So I'd rather have a platform than to remove myself.
Thank you for that answer. I think there's one last kind of big question, because there's a few other Q&A questions to tap into, and I wanted to ask about it too, is, you know, now this pandemic has hit us. There's been the George Floyd protests. It seems like the art world is in this moment of shift and change. your work is so much about physical connection and bodies working together and hosting parties. How does this context, and maybe also, I know we've had conversations, through the lockdown and talking to you in Chicago and your experiences there. And so the context of Chicago, how are these things relating to continuing to make work or to your practice in general?
Yeah, and my work, as I said, is about, as I've presented, is about gatherings. It's about finding social solidarity, bringing people together to celebrate, to move, to watch, to enjoy, but it's about physical gatherings. I've been really thinking about protest in many ways. One of me just being on the street, and I'm pointing this way because I have a window right here in my house, and that's where the protests are happening. And going out and, wearing a mask and putting myself out there, but also thinking, and so I had said something about, I've been thinking a lot about like, how do I make performance outdoors, on the street, in public spaces where we can social gather, hopefully more in the future. But I've really been thinking about, I should be right now in Brazil presenting a work at MASPE, which really changed because I was still developing it during, before the lockdown. And I was thinking then also about, the Brazilian, tragic government that's very similar to this tragic government here in America. And the idea of like not taking care of people, not, acknowledging this virus, this pandemic. And I started thinking a lot about noise as a way to gather. And I started thinking about that at 8 o'clock when the hospital shift changes here in Chicago. People go out their windows and make noise to say like, we're here together. And I've been talking to the curators at MASPE, and they were saying like at 8 o'clock, everyone, people from the left come outside and start to scream, bring down the dictator. And so I was thinking about the idea of like almost a primal scream, a release, the noise as a way to gather and protest without being in proximity of each other. I've also been thinking about visual noise. So I've been developing here in this apartment of mine, a new dance piece where I've been working with this Kenyan fabric that's, it's a Maasai warriors wear, and it's very intense colors. And it's a colonial fabric that was now become a tradition to what Maasai warrior wears, but the visual noise creates a protection from the warrior against predators in the bush. And so I've been really thinking about like noise as collectivity, noise through visual noise. So I've been making these protest banners, blankets, shields that are, when the dancers hold them, it'll give them a 6 feet distancing. So I've been working on those types of ideas right now. I'm also going to be doing on October 17th, I'm creating a whole new dance piece with Zoom with 8 dancers. So everything happens on Zoom. We're thinking about the virtual space as safe space. I've been thinking about filters as a way to bring us all together. We all have the same filter. So how do we think about and challenge the space of gathering? So that's where I'm kind of at right now with 2 projects that I'm just giving you like a little tidbit of information about.
Yeah, one of our listeners this evening discussed the role of temporality within your work and ideas around time and whether the pandemic has shifted the way you might work with it. Maybe you've touched on it already, but I thought I would just give that comment out. And then one last question, and it kind of ties into the project we're working on. People wanted to hear a bit more about the film piece. How long is it? What was the impetus for it? They said it looks and feels beautiful, and the visuals are very intriguing. And I know you may be screening it. Sorry, are you screening at the AGO or somewhere sooner rather than later? Or yeah. It's
gonna be shown at the Getty, like just again for I think it's like for an hour. You can watch it for an hour online, but it's really meant to be a looping like film installation. The piece again is based on falling, on like there's a lot of moments of the body falling, but then bodies picking them up. But it's all choreographed, so it's a very specific kind of piece. It has it, you know, we filmed it on a film set. We had lights, we had like these amazing cameras. So you get these kind of angles. Like there's a moment where all the dancers fall to the ground, and then the cameras are just like panning over all of their bodies and kind of just like kind of caressing them, and you get these shots where you feel intimacy. So again, touch without touch is also something that I've been thinking about. So the idea that the camera can give us that perspective. Again, live performance is always going to be one thing, and I'm missing live performance so hard. I'm missing being with my dancers so hard. I want to be in a studio with them, but I've been thinking about other ways. So the film is sort of thinking about that touch without touch, but I'm also working on the notion of the glamorized fallen body. So thinking again about specifically Hollywood film from the 1930s about Busby Berkeley, where he created these sets, these screens where, you know, the bodies all had fans, and it was like about like creating those floral kind of kaleidoscopic like patterns. When the dancers fall, they all start to kind of crawl to each other, and then they make those patterns, and then they become this kaleidoscope. So it becomes this abstraction as well. You know, it's like about a reality of these bodies falling, but then it becomes this beautiful, like, you know, morphing like structure. So yeah, I really was thinking a lot about beauty. I was thinking a lot about you know, aesthetics. You know, I think all of my work plays with aesthetics. Even in the Master and Form, it's a weird BDSM playground, but it's beautiful. There's always this sense of like and I think that for me is a tension. Is the idea that there's a tension between, you know, this idea of this romanticized beautiful dance, maybe even like, you know, as Nathan said, this idea of jovial celebration, but then there's always this opposition of a dynamic of power. At the end of the day, my work is about questioning hegemony. It's about like creating a space of criticality between dynamics of power, you know? And I think for me, as a queer POC who's celebrating Pride with you all, I also like need to remember that Pride is something that is not just a month, it's not just a day, it's a lived experience, you know? And sometimes I may not feel proud because I might be told something or different, but that's, you know, that's the younger me. And I think it's really important to like remember that we keep going, and it's a lived experience. And so I play with that within my practice for sure.
They're really loving you. Can I just ask you one last question, and then we'll call it a night?
Yeah.
The crowd's loving it. Hi, Brendan.
Yeah.
I saw your piece at the Whitney Biennial last summer, but I wasn't able to see the actual live performance. However, I was super fascinated by your sculptures' devices and where they were placed in the gallery space. I was just wondering what your process is to create your sculptures, and what level of instruction do you give your dancers when they are interacting with the pieces? And I think this connects to the Inaction exhibition as well.
Yeah, because Inaction also like has a set of devices that came out after the Whitney Biennial. And so as an artist who makes sculpture as well, like I start with maquettes. Like it's literally like I'm cutting up toothpicks, but I have all my references from like, you know, where they're coming from. And each piece of the Whitney Biennial has a title in like classical French language, ballet language, that is the position that the dancer should be in. So when you say to a dancer, fifth in first, they'll know what to do. And so there's that thing. But again, in the process, I kind of think I start to sketch. Sometimes I'm embarrassed to show my sketches, but I work then with making sketches and then making maquettes. And then I take them to the architecture firm that I work with. And they we kind of start to draw them out in a 3D space. And then we go into production. And then when I work with the dancers, like, you know, we literally, so when I go into the gallery space, the installation becomes like a dance for me. I have to walk into the space and think about the space beforehand, and then I bring in the architects. You know, for the Whitney Biennial, we started thinking a lot about thresholds, the window thresholds. I had a big window, a bank of windows, and then we created that threshold with like thin painted lines, that went through the whole space. So it felt like an open porous space, but that also gives rhythm and cadence for the dancers to move in. And so it also helps with the choreography. How do they move into the spaces? So then I always work with the dramaturg, who then will be making notations as we're in the creative process. And then when we create a whole vocabulary, I then set it. So as I said, with master and form, it had to be set because the ballet dancers needed like it time. So I'm like, you know, after like a number of counts here, there's one person who was called the counter. They would clap it. That gave the cue to move to the next phase. But it was very much regimented. And in processes that have more improvised actions, it's more about motifs and tasks. Like between this time and this time, you have to do this task. So again, I work a lot with the kind of like choreography of labor. Like you have a task, you have a job, you have to do this within this time. And so it gets kind of like, with those ones, it's a little bit more open, but they can do certain things. Or I do things called flocking. So at a certain point, if one dancer does something and another dancer starts to follow it, then they all have to start to do it. So eventually the whole group is doing the same thing. And I think moving in unison is a really important, beautiful space to show solidarity, to show understanding, to show, you know, a question of giving to someone as well. And I always have like this kind of quote unquote, like leader. Actually, I don't like to call it the leader, but it's just the person that is kind of like the authoritative, but it's always passed through. So like even in the master and form, they do a bar routine in the cage, so a ballet bar, but each section of the bar gets switched to another person, and then they count it out. And if they don't feel comfortable saying it in English, they call it out in their own language. So it gives them more of an authoritative voice to speak in.
Thanks, Brennan. I'm going to call back Henry to wrap this up, and I think he might sneak in one last question. Thank you for staying up late. I know it's later in Chicago.
It's fine. This is such a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Brendan. And yeah, I'm just sneaking just one last question to wrap this up. So you share a little bit about in the slides, for example, in the free fall project, and there's this a lot of gatherings that kind of continue after the actual performance happened. So maybe, well, this is just like my observation, do you find that when the performances happen, take place outdoors, and people tend to join the occasions, the gatherings more freely, while when the performances happened in like a museum setting, and people's reactions tend to be a little bit restrained. And maybe there's this kind of this difference that you have noticed, and then yeah, and then sorry, I just kind of thinking out loud, and then perhaps how you know, when the different works are presented different contexts, and how have been the audience reacting?
So I think that, you know, like for example, I never have a call time, or I rarely have a call time of when the performance will happen. So sometimes things are unannounced. So if you walk into the space and you're like, something's happening in the museum, people are sometimes like, what's happening? What's that person doing? But then they're like, oh, that's performance art. This is a museum. This happens here. So it's still, it is a little bit more of something that people will just are allowed to encounter with. But I like to also still, you know, if I tell my dancers, like, you have an authority that if you go up to the audience, they'll move. And so that they'll play with them and kind of almost move them around and herd them in spaces when it's in that kind of a gallery or public space. And that also is a really hard thing for dancers to do, because they're like, not me, what? I'm like, no, go up your body. Well, you know, you don't have to touch them or say anything, but you can challenge the space. And so in museums, I'll play with them on that kind of tension. When I'm working in outdoor spaces, it's a lot different. It's a lot more challenging, but I like to do it. Like, for example, with I'm Down, we travel on the train a lot. And, you know, they were all just sitting there and they were doing things like, you know, like, and mimicking things and kind of like moving and like how and people are like, what are those people doing? You know, like, what's happening? So there's a different reaction, but all still one that kind of challenged the space. And so I'm pretty aware of what will kind of happen within a museum versus what will happen on a street, you know. But I'm trying to kind of do more of the street work, you know, even just, you know, bodies right now, like, you know, standing on the street, you know, gesturing, you know, some of our flag gestures, or trying to create language with their bodies, or again, this noise performance. So I've really been thinking about that. I think that answered your question, Ask.
Well, thank you so much, Brendan. I missed
Thank
applause. Yay! Thank you.
But thank you.
For people that want more of this, there is a second event on August the 1st. Contact Art Center at richmond.ca to RSVP. If you didn't get to ask your question, I think there might be more time. I don't know, Brendan, if you know what you might be doing on that on Saturday, if you want to give some tidbits.
The tidbits, I think Lou and I are going to do a protest creation where we'll kind of find a way to protest and speak to each other via Zoom. We're then also going to try to create some kind of idea of how do we all move together in this virtual space, whether it be through breath, whether it be through gesture, but it'll really be participatory. So I hope to see you guys there, sure, on Saturday, the 1st of August. Oh my God, August.
And thank you so much, Henry, and thank you to everyone.
Yes, thank you, Henry.
This evening. And Brendan, do you have any last words you want to say before you? Oh, look, there's how you can find everything about Brendan Fernandez.
I just want to say thank you for having me. You know, let's keep moving. We have a lot of work to still do. So happy Pride, but remember the work is never done. But we'll get there. But we still have to be proactive and keep the conversations, the dialogues, the actions. I'm gonna leave with like perform your politics. So please do that. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone, and have a good night. And we'll see each other soon. Bye.